Hi, folks. I'm Chris Dorr. I'm the director here for Ohio Gun Owners. And in this video, I am going to address some of the utter nonsense that is being peddled by some of the Blue 28, the liberal RINO Republicans who voted against the Second Amendment Preservation Act, and our efforts to amend that bill into Senate Bill 58. Now, as a quick recap, the Second Amendment Preservation Act, or SAPA as we call it for short, simply says that Ohio law enforcement, which Ohio taxpayers pay for to enforce Ohio laws, that they are prohibited from being commandeered by federal agencies or the federal government for purposes of enforcing federal gun control laws. Now, this legislation was introduced in the Ohio General Assembly in January of 2021 as a direct response to Joe Biden's seizure of the White House, as a way really for Ohioans to peacefully invoke Ohio's powers under the 10th Amendment to tell him, his congressional allies, and particularly his federal agencies like the ATF to go pound sand, for lack of a better term. Now, this SAPA legislation was attempted to be amended into Senate Bill 58 on the floor of the House. It had already passed the Ohio House government oversight. It had been refined and revised in response to federal court rulings out of Missouri, where the bill was first passed. And the language of the bill is ready for prime time. It's ready to become law. Now, in this video, I am going to use comments that were put out by Representative Rodney Creech, one of the Blue 22 Republicans who joined up with Ohio's worst Democrats, these Democrat gun control representatives, to kill the amendment, to show you, the voters who elected Republicans like Rodney Creech to fight for the Second Amendment instead of against it, as an example of how these politicians are deliberately manipulating the truth, relying on lies, and hoping that you are too stupid to see through their nonsense to notice. Ultimately, their goal, I think, is to make you go away and hope that nobody primaries them for selling them out and voting against your gun rights. So I'm just going to jump right into it. I'm going to pull this up here. This is you're looking at the press release that Rodney Creech released, and I'm going to read through this, and I'm going to just go right through his press release and then break down his statements line by line. So I'm going to jump into this first paragraph here, and Creech writes, "As many of you are aware, yesterday in Columbus," I'm going to pull it up here. Yesterday in Columbus, there was an attempt to pass the language from House Bill 51, or better known as the Second Amendment Preservation Act. Late in the evening, SB 58 was scheduled to be voted on and sent back over to the Senate for a concurrence vote. SB 58 is a fantastic and well thought out bill that strengthens Ohio's Second Amendment rights by prohibiting any requirement of firearm liability insurance in the state. There was an attempt to amend HB 51 into SB 58 before we had the opportunity to vote, and that motion to amend was then put up for a vote to lay on the table, basically meaning that we would not accept the amendment. Now, let's just back up here for just a few seconds. We agree that Senate Bill 58 is a good bill. It's a great piece of legislation that deals with some of the more ancillary threats to our Second Amendment freedoms, but it didn't do anything to address the direct threats being made against our gun rights by Joe Biden, the Democrats in Congress, or the rogue agencies that were rewriting the rules under the NFA and making felons out of millions of Americans who purchase their firearms and firearm accessories legally, like pistol braces. So we wanted to add SAPA language to SB 58 in order to make SB 58 even better, and it would have. But back to Creech, he writes, "The Second Amendment Preservation Act has been in the General Assembly since near the beginning of 2023. Actually, that's not true. It was introduced in the General Assembly in February of 2021, less than a month after Joe Biden got into office, because Joe Biden made it very clear what he wanted to do to Ohio's gun rights." Creech continues, "Throughout this time, I have had the opportunity to sit down with many affected parties and concerned constituents. As a strong supporter of our law enforcement agencies around the state, I stand with them and their concerns for how this bill will limit their ability to keep the people of this great state safe. Now, there's a lot to unpack here. First of all, he starts out his objections to SEPA not by affirming his strong support of the Second Amendment and the right to self-defense against tyrannical government, which is what the Second Amendment is all about, but rather law enforcement agencies around the state. Now, that's a little problematic. He says, I stand with them and their concerns for how this bill will limit their ability to keep the people of this great state safe. The fact of the matter is that Rodney Creech wasn't elected to represent Ohio's law enforcement agencies back to his district. He was elected to represent the people of his district at the Ohio General Assembly to create the laws that Ohio's law enforcement agencies are required to enforce. That is why we call it a republic. His priorities here, like the rest of the Blue 28's priorities, are dead wrong. But this is where it gets a little more telling, because in this next part of his statement, he illustrates how badly he does not understand the actual legislation. Creech quotes from the SEPA amendment language. Let me pull this up here. Now, lines 557 through 568, he quotes from the best part of SEPA as a reason why he opposes it. Listen to this. He says, one key portion of HB 51 states that no public officer, or employee of the state or a political subdivision shall enforce, attempt to enforce, or participate in any way in the enforcement of federal acts, executive orders, administrative rules, rules, regulations, statutes, or ordinances regarding firearms, accessories, or ammunition. No public office, public officer, or employee of the state or political subdivision shall accede to a request from another to give material aid or support to the efforts of the other in the enforcement of our implementation of any federal acts, laws, executive orders, rules, regulations, or ordinances regarding firearms, accessories, or ammunition. It's all a direct quote from our bill. From the amendment language, like I said, lines 557 through 568. All of that language that I just read here that he quoted is the meat and potatoes part of SEPA. It's the part where the state of Ohio tells the ATF to go pound sand, that Ohio's law enforcement is going to enforce Ohio law when it comes to guns, not their federal crap. So now we get to the reasoning, the excuse in his own words why Creech voted with the Democrats to kill this pro-gun amendment. Creech says that this means that any use of federal tools by law enforcement, Ohio law enforcement, could be seen as aiding the federal government in enforcing those laws. This vague language would handicap our law enforcement officers from using tools such as the NIBIN, the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, and the E-Trace network, which assist our law enforcement officers every day. It would also put them at risk of violating this law if they work with any federal agencies or task forces about cases, as those federal agents could use this information shared to enforce federal law. That sounds bad, doesn't it? I mean, we don't want Ohio cops to be prohibited from having access to the National Integrated Ballistics Information Network now, do we? The NIBIN? Of course not. That's why only a few paragraphs later in the amendment, the SEPA bill specifically says, starting at lines 625, and I quote, let me pull this up here, and I quote, nothing in this section shall be construed to prohibit public officers or employees of the state or a political subdivision of the state from requesting or accepting aid from federal officials in an effort to enforce laws of the state or a political subdivision. Remember how he said that SEPA would cut off Ohio law enforcement from NIBIN, the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network? Line 637 literally says, let me pull this up here. Nothing in this section shall be construed to prohibit public officers or employees of the state or political subdivision of the state from participating with federal law enforcement to enforce laws of the state or political subdivision in any national integrated ballistic information network investigation or lead. NIBIN. Right there, folks. There it is in black and white. Or distributing such leads, whether or not through a crime gun intelligence center. We literally, in black and white, provided for the problem that he erected falsely as his excuse to vote against this legislation. The problem here is that Rodney Creech and the rest of the anti-gun Blue 28 didn't even read the bill or the amendment that they were voting on, which is the one job they are required to do if they become a state representative. They didn't even read the amendment that they were voting on. The excuse that Rodney Creech used to vote against the bill, the amendment, is literally and specifically addressed and provided for in the exceptions section that was only a few paragraphs after the paragraph he quoted. I don't know about you, but if I was Rodney Creech, I'd come down off of my Shetland pony on this and be utterly humiliated, because that is clear and present proof that he pulled a Nancy Pelosi and voted on a gun bill that he didn't even bother to read. What an embarrassment. But okay, let's get past it. Let's get back to the rest of Creech's press release about this. He writes, "Our law enforcement officers in this great state have no wish to violate the Second Amendment in any way, shape, or form." Now, that's pretty silly. This is a pretty silly attempt to paint with a broad brush and lump all of Ohio law enforcement into one bucket, because that's not accurate at all. As we've said dozens and dozens of times here at Ohio Gun Owners, Ohio's beat cops, the ones that are actually on the streets, the one you see driving around patrol cars and stuff like that, they are in large part pro-gun and pro-Second Amendment because they know that we, the people, are statistically the best citizens in any state in America. But it isn't the beat cops that are opposing SEPA at the Ohio State House. It's the Buckeye State Sheriff's Association. It's the Ohio Fraternal Order of Police, the Ohio Prosecuting Attorneys Association, and the Ohio Chiefs of Police Association that are opposing the Second Amendment Preservation Act. It is those organizations who are putting out bulletins of opposition and convincing sheriffs across the state to lobby against SEPA. And there's two reasons why they're doing that. Number one, these political law enforcement associations long ago stopped representing the cops on the street and became total political prostitutes to the political class in Columbus. They've turned into full-blown gun control activists and have testified against every single pro-gun bill that has come before the Ohio General Assembly, going all the way back to 2004's concealed carry law. The Buckeye State Sheriff's Association lobbyist, Muskingum County Sheriff Matt Lutz, stood in the Ohio House Committee in his taxpayer-funded uniform and testified against constitutional carry, predicting that Ohio would become a vigilante justice state if they did away with the state licensure of self-defense. So, matter of fact, and in fact, Representative Creech, Ohio law enforcement in this state do not all universally support the Second Amendment. Let's keep going here, though, because the Ohio's FOP lobbyist, Michael Weinman, has viciously testified against stand your ground law and constitutional carry. So has Lou Tobin, quite frankly, from the Ohio County Prosecuting Attorneys Association. And so did Hans von Eckertsburg from the Ohio Association of Chiefs of Police. To a person, these law enforcement officers or representatives of law enforcement officers who Rodney Creech says support the Second Amendment, they have predicted the skyrocketing vigilante justice, shootouts at the OK Corral, the street corners, targeting of minorities when it comes to stand your ground law, and accidental shootings on the daily. But you know what? They have all been dead wrong. And as Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost pointed out in his study a couple of months ago, violent crime has plummeted as the Ohio Second Amendment, or as the Ohio General Assembly restored gun rights to we the people by passing pro-gun bills. But the second reason here why these political law enforcement associations that Representative Creech is siding with instead of pro-gun voters in his district, the second reason why these political law enforcement associations are so vigorous in their opposition to SEPA law is the money. And quite frankly, for Representative Creech and the rest of these anti-gun Blue 28 RINOs to not be upfront and admit to you, he should have done this, not be upfront and admit in this press release that the real reason he's trying to kill SEPA, which is the massive inflow of federal money and the federalization of Ohio law enforcement, this is quite shameful for Representative Creech and might indicate that he thinks his voters are stupid when I stop and think about it. It's totally shameful for him not to admit the huge financial motive of some of these gun control organizations to try to kill SEPA. One of the most perfect statements, honestly, in all of politics is follow the money. Here's the truth about why Ohio's anti-gun law enforcement associations and the anti-gun Blue 28 politicians who are doing their bidding at the State House are trying to kill SEPA. The flow of federal funds via the equitable sharing program at the Department of Justice. You see, under the federal equitable sharing program, when Ohio law enforcement agencies pair up with federal agencies to enforce federal laws of any kind, the local law enforcement, the local Ohio law enforcement agencies gets 80 to 90% of all proceeds generated in those joint task forces. Now, of course, our SEPA bill makes it clear that Ohio law enforcement agencies can still partner with federal agencies on drug task forces, sex trafficking task forces, human trafficking task forces. They can even help the feds if there are guns found during one of those sex, drug, or human trafficking task forces. They just can't join with the ATF or any other federal agency on federal gun task forces and instead have to stick to enforcing the gun laws of the state of Ohio. Oh my goodness. But none of that matters to Ohio's anti-gun law enforcement associations because they want to be part of any future ATF gun control task forces because of the massive amount of federal monies that come along with those. Now, Ronnie Creech will never admit any of this to you. He left all of this money part out of his explanation for voting against SEPA and tried to pretend it was all about having the backs of Ohio law enforcement. But you want to know how much money Ohio's law enforcement agencies have already received from the feds as part of these joint task forces under the federal equitable sharing programs? Again, Rodney Creech didn't talk about any of this. But as of 2019, which is the most recent data that I have, Ohio law enforcement has already scooped up over $233 million in federal money. That's just since 2019. I would imagine it's probably somewhere near $300 million by now. But you'll never hear anything about that from Rodney Creech, and you'll never hear about this from the anti-gun law enforcement associations trying to kill SEPA. And just so we're clear, the vast majority of that money is discretionary funding, meaning these departments get to spend that money any way that they deem fit. They don't got to go to their county government for approval. They don't need to go to justify this spending to their taxpayers. They can't even be held accountable for it. That's what this is all about. These anti-gun groups are defending their addiction to the federal trough of your tax dollars, the one that you don't even know exists. And that's one of the benefits, one of the features of SEPA. It reorients Ohio law enforcement to being local. It resists, it pushes back on this gradual slide towards the federalization of local law enforcement. And that's a good thing. It's a very good thing. You know, It says in Matthew 6 in the Bible that no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. It is true in the Bible, and it is true today, and it is true in Ohio politics that one cannot serve two masters. And quite frankly, that's exactly what is happening here now with Representative Rodney Creech and the rest of the anti-gun Blue 28. They were elected to serve you, their real masters, from the districts who elected them, and to pass laws like the Second Amendment Preservation Act that will protect your Second Amendment rights under the U.S. Constitution, as well as your rights under Article 1, Section 4 of the Ohio Constitution. But instead, they are serving their false masters in Ohio's anti-gun political law enforcement gun control lobby, who are only fighting to protect their access to the federal trough of unrestricted and unaccountable tax dollars. Rodney Creech knows this. He knows it very good and well. The rest of the Blue 28 know this too. And now you, the Ohio General Assembly's real bosses, know it too. There's one last thing I want to mention before I end this video, and that is the objection that this was a hostile takeover of a Senate bill, and that had SAPA been allowed to be amended onto Senate Bill 58, it would have magically killed the underlying legislation. This is ridiculous on the face of it. If Senate Bill 58 had been amended with SAPA and sent back to the Senate could have simply voted no on concurrence and sent the bill to a conference committee and then stripped the SAPA portion back out of it. If they didn't want to go that route, they could have added the Senate Bill 58 legislation as an amendment to any other bill before the Ohio Senate and send it back to the House. In fact, what politicians like Creech and the Blue 28 are deliberately not telling you is that same day, Wednesday, the 11th of December, the Senate slammed 18 amendments into one single bill and sent it back over to the House. Don't take their bullshit. Additionally, anyone else telling you that they voted against the Second Amendment preservation, against SAPA, because the Senate didn't want to vote on it is just dumb. Or they think that you're dumb. Ohio elects representatives to the House of Representatives. This is earth-shattering for some, but Ohio elects representatives to the Ohio House of Representatives to pass legislation out of the House. And they elect senators to pass to the Ohio Senate to pass legislation out of the Senate. They are different chambers that represent different constituencies. So a representative who tells you they don't want to do their job because the Senate doesn't want to do their job is simply not being honest with you. They think you're stupid or they hate you. And anyone who tells you that amending SB 58 with SAPA would have killed that underlying bill is deliberately telling you an outright lie in the hope that the average Ohioan's lack of knowing legislative procedure, all the ins and outs, would get you angry at us, Ohio gun owners, for putting pressure on the legislators instead of the politicians for not doing the job they promised and were elected to do. The fact is, gun owners could have had it all if the politicians in Columbus had simply fought for you instead of the special interest groups that most of them really serve. As of right now, Representative Rodney Creech and the rest of the anti-gun Blue 28 voted against the most significant and important gun rights protection bill to ever come to the floor of the Ohio House. And the only way they can fix this terrible violation of their own character and their own word, which they were promising back when they were campaigning in 2022, is to pass the Second Amendment Preservation Act with zero weakening amendments, or this can be fixed by their removal in an upcoming Republican primary election. But that's up to you.